Let me ask you something. What do you think this picture is? Go on, take a real good close look at it. Really look at it from every angle that you can. Alright, hang on to your answer. Don't change it now. When I say go, you tell me what you think this is. Ready? 3, 2, 1, go. Alright, now if you said that this was a drawing of a hat, well then welcome to Aster's Abode. We have a lot to talk about. But if you were a little more on the creative side and said something completely different, something along the lines of a boa constrictor swallowing an elephant, good job. You know exactly what we're going to talk about.
Tout avec lui dit boum quand notre cœur fait boum boum. Le vent dans les bois fait ouh, la bicheuse à bois fait meh, la vaisselle cassée fait fric fric frac, et les pieds mouillés font flic flic flac, mais boum quand notre cœur fait boum. Tout avec lui dit boum, l'oiseau dit boum, c'est l'orage. Brrr, boum.
While The Little Prince doesn't exactly start with a once upon a time or in a long time ago, we do get a personal anecdote from the first character we meet, the narrator. As I've shown you earlier, this is not a hat, but it is a work of art. See, when they were 6 years old, the narrator was inspired to draw this piece upon reading about how boa constrictors swallow their prey whole from a nature book. That led to an interest in drawing, which compelled them to make these two masterpieces at the time. They're both of the exact same subject matter, only with the latter one having more details on the innards, so that the grown-ups could get a better picture of what they were looking at. Our young narrator was really proud with his work the first time, so he ought to show it to the grown-ups, who I presume to be his parents, and simply ask them if the drawing frightened them. Now, had I asked that same question to you earlier, you probably would have had a similar response to, frightened? Why would anyone be frightened of a hat? Valid point, but that's not a hat. So, the narrator drew the second piece so that the grown-ups could understand this time. But instead of taking the time to really digest and appreciate the artistic merit of this beautifully drawn pencil piece, the parents were really dismissive of the narrator's work. The parents stressed that our young narrator should pursue more meaningful and fulfilling disciplines in his life. Disciplines like grammar, geometry, history, arithmetic. Your go-to academics, really. This severely discouraged our young narrator from pursuing any form of artistic career later on in life, which eventually led down to his path of becoming a pilot later. He was disheartened by the supposed failure of his masterpieces, as apparently it was a big letdown to everyone else that he had the audacity to be creative. Alright, can I just say, I don't exactly know how this whole parenthood thing works. Like most people on the internet, I'm another fatherless individual, so there you have it. But aren't you supposed to entertain your child? Aren't you supposed to encourage them? I mean, goodness, those are some terrible parents. Why are you shutting down the hopes, dreams, and imagination of a 6-year-old? A toddler? That would be like, oh, what's that, little Jimmy? You just got done reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and you want to grow up to be an inventor just like Mr. Willy Wonka? Well, too bad! Here's a copy of what they teach you at Harvard Business School. Better get to work. A tragedy for sure, but this does set up the recurring narrative all throughout The Little Prince really well, which is matters of consequence, i.e. what matters. The way I see it, The Little Prince is all about the different perspectives of different kinds of people when it comes to what they think matters in life. And in the first chapter, we're introduced to the perspective of the grown-ups who think that, from looks and appearances alone, you can judge the full merit and value of something, along with their behavior in dictating to our young narrator what they think matters in life. As a consequence, the narrator grows up to be really resentful of grown-ups, so much so that they never really form any close personal relationships or meaningful friendships with any grown-up, or actually anyone in general, because they can't talk about the things that really matter to them, as the grown-ups would much rather talk about the really important stuff. That is until they meet with a very curious little fellow when they crash-landed into the desert. Now, whether or not it really is Mr. Exupéry himself speaking as the narrator is irrelevant to my interpretation of the story, as I believe they occupy a perspective that each and every single one of us will have in life. That perspective being the bridging understanding between the adult world and the child world. We'll see later on that the Little Prince absolutely cannot get along with grown-ups. No, it's not happening. It can't happen. As He only has the perspective of a child, so he doesn't understand any of the ridiculous things that grown-ups call normal in that world. The narrator, however, has the experiences of both the faults and merits of the grown-up world and the child world, which allows for that understanding of both worlds and consequently allows for their relationship with the little prince. So for the first time in their life, the narrator has the little prince to call their friend during their extended stay in the desert. So what makes this little guy so special anyway? Well, he's kind of silly. But that's most children. After all, they may know the least about our world, but they seem to see things in a way that no one else really can. Don't get me wrong though, there's still a lot of things that the little prince doesn't understand about the world, and that's up to the job of the narrator later on to explain things to him. The two met together when they both fell from the sky, about a year apart from each other, and they got along really well during their extended time in the desert. The little prince would ask things of the narrator, either questions or drawings, and in return the little prince would talk about his various experiences and memories when visiting Earth. That's right, buddy. The little prince is much too wholesome for this world, so he doesn't come from it. But first, what's he like anyway? Well, while the story repeatedly makes it clear that you shouldn't let appearances alone be the sole factor in how you judge someone, let me paint you a picture. He's a little kid with emerald green trousers and vestments. Around his neck, he wears a silky smooth scarf. He's got blonde hair, and just like most children, I'd say he's about as tall as half a dozen cans of Chef Boyardee's beef ravioli. Heck, if you cut him open and looked at what was inside, he'd probably have a bunch of red gloopy substances, just like a can of Chef Boyardee beef ravioli. For his personality, the little prince asks questions. Lots and lots and lots of questions. Pretty much to everyone he meets. He's a little kid after all, he can't help himself. It's in his nature to be inquisitive, much to the annoyance of many people he meets. We see this a lot during his interactions with the narrator, wherein he would never let go of any question that he asked. Once it's out there, he's gonna keep bugging and pestering you about it, so you better answer it. Along with that, he also always speaks exactly what's on his mind, sometimes in the brutally honest and hilarious fashion. You know, it isn't enough that you answer his questions, you also have to deal with what he has to say afterwards, and sometimes he can be judgmental. But hey, the little prince only judges someone until after he's got to know someone, once he's got all his questions done and answered. I do think most children are like that as well. Listen, as wonderful as politeness is to preserve our feelings, sometimes we can't actually say what's really on our mind. That this whole social back and forth we do with people is covered always in vain niceties. Besides, if you're overly kind, you deprive yourself of spicy quotes such as, "But I can judge myself anywhere. I do not need to live on your planet." That makes him swell up with pride, but he is not a man, he is a mushroom. And my personal favorite? You are of no use to the stars. Imagine how much more exciting life would be if we all spoke like that. Terrible. Terribly exciting, but still terrible. Context aside, children are almost always honest. Almost anyway, though if you raised them correctly, they wouldn't have much reason to lie in the first place. So the little prince isn't of this world. No, he's from asteroid B612, a humble little rock floating in the middle of space. That's his home alright, and he takes good care of it. After all, it only makes sense to take good care of what really matters to you. But eventually, he had to leave his home for reasons that I'll just attribute to his flaw of naivety. He's a little kid after all, and no one in this story is without fault. And besides, if I told you every single itty-bitty detail that happens in the story, there wouldn't be much room left for you to interpret for yourself, for when you read it on your own. You better. But I will say that the period between his departure from home and arrival on Earth is the most significant part of the story when it comes to hearing about the different perspectives of grown-ups when it comes to matters of consequence. Because in his journey across the stars, the little prince gets to meet with different grown-ups, or at least caricatures of the various negative qualities that a lot of them tend to have, and this is where the perspective of a child and adult really tend to clash together. Because even when these bozos explain themselves to the little prince, he still has a really difficult time understanding them. Because, you know, not only has he not lived through the perspective of being a grown-up, I'm pretty sure even grown-ups can't understand the grown-up world. Across his journey through the stars, the little prince meets with a total of 6 grown-ups before he arrives on Earth. He has a back and forth with each and every single one of them, as not only is he curious about what they all have to say and what they're doing, but he's also looking for a friend. Unfortunately, he won't find that with any of the grown-ups. However, he does get to learn a little bit about them and be a little confused in the process because of how ridiculous some of their reasonings are. In no particular order, I'll be discussing the lot of them and what they mean to represent, starting with the businessman. When the little prince arrived on the businessman's planet, the latter was really preoccupied with counting his sums. Not money per se, but the stars, which he claims to be the sole owner of. Now, I don't know about you, but if I met some bald old schmuck with a suit and tie who claimed to be the sole proprietor of high heaven above, I wouldn't think much of it because of how desensitized I've become to the utter lunacy of this reality. Understandably, our little fella is really confused by this, so he pesters the businessman with a bunch of questions to make sense of it all, much to his displeasure. Basically, it all works out like this to the businessman. Since no one else is around to lay claim to the stars, the businessman has taken it upon himself to fulfill that role, and so he endlessly and fruitlessly counts the stars over and over again to, you know, take stock. And what use does counting all the stars provide him? Why, it makes him really rich, of course. Rich so that he may count even more stars, so that he may have more. And to secure this count, he writes it down on a piece of paper and locks it in a safe. All 501,622,731 he has counted thus far. You know, the stars. Those pretty lights you see when you look up during the night sky. You would have an easier time counting individual grains of sand on a beach, as a lot of people can reasonably claim that there are infinite stars. Counting stars to count more stars? Alright, if this wasn't corporately clear, this represents greed. Specifically the futility in hoarding wealth for the purposes of hoarding even more wealth. Now, I'm not saying that kids themselves can't be greedy, alright? Anyone who grew up with siblings or cousins can attest to that. But the businessman represents someone who endlessly obsesses over Uncle Sam's toilet paper to the point that it's all that matters to them. This is a part of the narrative Matters of Consequence that the little prince gets to experience firsthand. That is, grown-ups who believe that all there is to life is numbers and figures. Even the narrator is aware of this, deathly aware, as there are a lot of grown-ups who believe that by simply slapping on an arbitrary number to something, or dare I say someone, you can determine all the value and worth from that. Now, of course, numbers and figures, they do matter, but they're not all that matters. The human brain, being the rational pile of sinking goop that it is, equates the patterns to this, that if a number is high, and you attach that number to something, that must mean that that something is very valuable, and if the number is low, that something is not very valuable. That's simply how instinct works for the human brain. That's reasonable for most things, but it gets unreasonable when you derive all the worth of something from that alone, because that's instinct. And oftentimes when you act and think, well, not even think, when you act on instinct alone, you get really irrational, ironically. Now, what I think a good example of this is, despite the fact that it deviates a little from the primary focus of this caricature, is the current nature of our educational systems. Now, as I've mentioned before, the instinct goes like this. When a human brain sees a high number attached to something, it's automatically going to assume that that something is very valuable. That's pattern recognition. And while pattern recognition has assisted us greatly in surviving over the millennia, at the very core of it, it is an instinct. It's the human instinct that lets us form expectations. Because there are patterns all over nature, and they're interacting with each other at all times. With pattern recognition, human pattern recognition anyway, it lets us simplify things into neat little expectations. You know, if X, then Y. What goes up must come down. Most of the time, anyway. But because these are simplifications, it becomes very problematic when you apply them to people, because people are hardly simple. Because expectations can lead you to become prejudiced. And what does this have to do with school? Well, I'm talking about grades. You can become prejudiced to believe that a person with high grades is smart and a person with low grades is stupid, but it goes so much deeper than that. We as humans are very dynamic, complicated, and sometimes very difficult to understand because there's a lot of things happening to us at all times. And for someone to utilize expectations in believing that high grade smart, low grade dumb is a prejudice in the fact that you're not getting to know what that person did to get to that point. Someone can despise mathematics, biology, history, whatever, academic, with all their heart and mind, but they can get high grades in that regard simply because of the effort they put into learning about it. And what I believe for the most part is that school and grades, they don't exactly measure intelligence, they measure work ethic. And because the breadth of human capability is far more vast and diverse than any person could reasonably quantify, work ethic represents a tiny fraction of what makes someone intelligent. Along with prejudice leading to expectations based on arbitrary characteristics is just how easy it is to exploit those expectations. As a callback to the first chapter, to the grown-ups who believe that all there is to something are the looks and appearances, when you apply that to people, you get bigots who believe that just because of how a person looks, what they believe in, or who they love, that they should be treated any less human. When that exploitation is applied to numbers and figures, you get your average rich person. Now, while it is neither explicitly stated nor straight up implied in The Little Prince itself that the businessman is exploitative, when you look into the real world and see how a lot of rich people get their wealth, you tend to see that they stepped on a lot of fingers and toes on their way up to the top. And you know, personally, it's my belief that there genuinely has to be something wrong with the way you think if you believe that that's a fulfilling way to live your life, getting richer and richer by the day. But that's just me. Now, going full English teacher mode here, another exploitation that I would say is straight up ignored is with school. Now, am I saying that school is specifically designed to make you suffer? No. Most of them anyway. But there are still exploitative characteristics to it. From what I've experienced and observed, education doesn't exactly cater to the individual needs and circumstances of everyone because education is standardized. Standardized as in it's simplified, simplified as in it's there to fulfill expectations. A good portion of the people who go to school are there because they genuinely want to learn and put the effort into doing that, and I respect that, but a vast majority of us are here to fulfill expectations. I know a lot of smart people, and they can be funny, charming, friendly, nice, cooperative, and help you a lot during dark times, but they're some of the most physically miserable people that I've ever interacted with. Sunken eyes, dead stares, and acne all over. These can be people present here only to fulfill expectations, and in the process, they're really hurting themselves. I also know a lot of smart people with high grades who just so happen to be not so honest with themselves. They're smart, for sure, just in the way that they more or less figured a way out of the rat maze, so to speak. These are the kind of people who exploit the educational system because, well, it's very easily exploitable, to be perfectly honest. After all, can't fit a square peg through a round hole without one or the other breaking apart. So I'll just end off this chapter with a quote during an interaction the Little Prince had with the businessman, wherein he came up with this spiciest roast this side of the cosmos, which I mentioned earlier. Here's the whole thing verbatim. Quote, "I myself own a flower," unquote. He continued his conversation with the businessman, quote, "which I water every day. I own 3 volcanoes, which I clean out every week. For I also clean out the one that is extinct. One never knows. It is of some use to my volcanoes, and it is of some use to my flower, that I own them. But you are of no use to the stars." Stay cheeky, little guy. Stay cheeky. Next up is the Tippler. Chronically addicted, alcoholic, and pretty much helpless. And one of the few people that the Little Prince actually feels sorry for, given how sad his story is. But upon asking why he drinks so much, the Tippler answered with the reasoning that only left Little P more confused than satisfied, really. Here it is. He drinks to forget. Forget he is ashamed. Ashamed of drinking. I'll let that one sit with you for a while before I give my piece. Now, personally, I know a thing or two about addiction. There's more caffeine in my bloodstream than there is water. But it hasn't gotten to that point yet. So, what's the deal with this guy? Okay, listen. It's not my place to talk down someone who is suffering from addiction like that, because I haven't gone through that kind of pain in my life yet. And we're not here to degrade people anyway. We're more or less here to take apart the human psyche piece by piece to make us better understand what makes us all tick. More or less criticism rather than insults, really. But I understand. You could get addicted to something for a wide variety of reasons, whether that be out of necessity, a grim necessity, as a coping mechanism, or you really are just trying to forget about something. And once you get addicted to a certain substance, I understand that it becomes really, really hard to break that cycle of addiction. It takes a lot of time and effort, and it might even take years out of your life. Because the thing about addiction is that there comes a certain point where you become so addicted to a certain substance that your body physically cannot function without it. And so if you suddenly stop taking that addiction, you'll start malfunctioning, you'll get sick, you may even die. Heck, I experienced caffeine withdrawal and my head was hurting for a week. What more if I go with the stronger stuff? But what does addiction have to do with matters of consequence? Well, see, here's the beautiful thing about stories, in that no matter how bluntly an author may describe their intended message, people could still interpret it in a wide variety of ways, because that's what literature is supposed to be. That's what stories are supposed to be. They matter to different people in different ways because they evoke certain emotions that bring out the spiritual value in literature. So that's what makes different analyses and interpretations so neat, is that you get all these different perspectives, and oh, I didn't know that story mattered that way to that person. That's how it spoke to them. And the way the Tippler speaks to me is that in terms of regret, more or less. Because you can look at the Tippler as a character and do the surface level sweep of, oh, grown-ups, addiction bad, oh, I gotta avoid addiction. You can do that. And that's just fine if that's how that matters to you. But if you want to go deeper and really evoke those strong emotions about the story to see how it really matters to you, like the way the Tippler matters to me in terms of a commentary on regret, you should do that if you can. Though I'm not saying you should go full English teacher and somehow describe a way that this is somehow related to the Industrial Revolution and its consequences, though if you have a theory on that, feel free to leave them down below. But in terms of talking about regret, what the Tippler is saying for me is that grown-ups place value on a whole lot of things in the world, whether that be for materialistic reasons, absurd reasons, or genuine reasons. But in that climate, in arbitrarily assigning values onto things, you tend to forget that you're valuable too. You matter a whole lot, sometimes even more than you think, so you shouldn't let regret or mistakes weigh you down too much. Only enough, so that there's time to improve, of course. And I know how this looks. Look at this guy. Look at this swell young guy. He hasn't got a care in the world. Listen, pal. I may be a chipper spring child from the year 006, but I've already had my fair share with a few run-ins of regret. And well, for the longest time, I didn't know how to deal with it. Thankfully, though, I find peace in believing that you shouldn't try to forget regret or mistakes. It's good that you feel regret. It's good that you feel remorse, guilt, all those unhappy, unpleasant feelings about a mistake you did, because that would mean you recognize that mistake, and you can improve upon that. You can think about that mistake as much as necessary, so that you don't repeat it again. Personally, I shudder to think about having a conversation with a person equivalent to who I was even just a year ago, because there's the possibility that, oh, I haven't improved since then, oh god. But there's also the possibility that, hey, I'm so much better than that guy a year ago. Hey, look at how much I improved. And you're not gonna feel that if you try to forget it. Alright? So, don't forget that you matter, and don't forget that you make mistakes. Everyone does. But some people forget that they matter not because they're trying to bury their regret and mistakes, but because they can become so committed to something that they think that something is all that matters, so much so that they forget to take care of themselves. People like the lamplighter. Now, I sincerely hope that I'm doing this out of redundancy, because for some reason, I feel the need to explain what that is, as I'm beginning to realize that there may be people watching who don't even know what a candle is. So, quick history lesson. In the before times, before we got all this wonderful zip-zappy electricity around us, people got their lighting through means of lighting things on fire. Cause you know, that's one of the methods of getting light, either through thermal energy, that is fluorescence, or luminescence, with the biochemical reactions that fungi and some algae undergo to glow in the dark and look real pretty. And humans harnessed that fire to make torches and candles, and while they were decent lighting for the time, they were hardly sufficient for things like cities. So what we figured out is that we got a long metal pole, put a box on top of it, put some fuel in that said box, and light it on fire inside in a controlled manner so that the whole thing doesn't go up in flames. And that's a lamp, an old-timey lamp anyway. It uses oil as a substance for its fuel, and it was the lamplighter's responsibility to both light up that said lamp during nighttime and snuff it out once the sun rose. Entire cities used to be run by these old-timey lamps and lamp posts, lamplighters, and you know, a lot of people were upset when electricity came around because all the lamplighters were out of a job. When the little prince visited the lamplighter, the planet that the latter called home was very small. There was only enough comfortable real estate for the lamplighter and his lamp. In fact, the planet was so small that the rotational period, i.e. the day and night cycle, was over and done by the minute. 30 minutes here would have meant an entire month back there. This presented a really awful predicament for the lamplighter, as not only was he assigned the sole responsibility of snuffing out and lighting back up his lamp every minute, he also hated every day and subsequently minute of his job, as it's not what he really wanted to do. You see, there was nothing that the lamplighter really loved more in life other than sleeping. You poor fool. Despite this absurdity, the little prince actually respected the lamplighter, which is a really prestigious designation given how rare it is, because his job had actual meaning and purpose, and he respected that commitment and dedication to that job. See, the thing is, it wasn't always like this way. At the start of his profession, when the lamplighter was specifically assigned his duties, his planet actually spun much slower, so he had plenty of time to sleep. However, over time, his world seemingly went faster and faster, until more and more of time slipped by his fingers like the grains of sand that there were, until there was nothing left for him to grasp. Sound familiar? I also really adored the little prince's commentary upon lamenting his resentment for the lamplighter's situation. Quote, "That man is the only one of them all whom I could have made my friend. But his planet is indeed too small. There is no room on it for two people." Unquote. There are entire countries of grown-ups who believe that all there is to life is work, 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 often tiring yourself to death, as the individual person is reduced down to a mere replaceable cog churning in an indescribable machine working ostensibly for the benefit of all society. But you know, this kind of dangerous thinking wherein tireless service, slavery, is seen as some sort of honorable self-sacrifice, I believe it starts with school. Oh yeah, we're going there again, alright. As I mentioned earlier, I do believe that school is more or less reflective of your work ethic more than any actual concrete measures of intelligence, as difficult as measuring intelligence truly is. But you know, work ethic shouldn't just be about how much work you do, it's about how you balance it with everything else. In a better world, anyway. But to go full English teacher mode here again, the thing that really hammers down the lamplighter's woes in connection with the ineptitudes and absurdities starting with school for me is the context behind his profession in the first place. With reading the text carefully, you get to clearly see that the lamplighter was specifically ordered to do his duties. He didn't actively or consciously seek them out, he was instructed to do so. That leads me to believe the narrative behind the fact that he's fulfilling expectations. Expectations of him by other people. And where do we see plenty of that? Good old school. You know, most children don't choose to go to school. That is what is expected of them by their parents and the rest of the world. And while I understand that it's very important to educate our young ones very early on about the world, there comes a certain point where it gets really ridiculous. You learn about all these subjects almost every day, and when you go home, you don't even get to stop thinking about them, as you have to often do work to supposedly train you to become better at these subjects. Don't you think it's a tragedy that for most cases, you have to work 5 out of 7 days? How is that fair? How is it fair or right that most students get to joke about how much school is a prison to them? How is it normal that some people are actually proud of how little sleep they get and become scornful of those who get the full 8 hours? And I say full 8 hours when 8 is the absolute minimum for an adolescent like me. And you know what? Sure, fine. With a lot of hard work, you can accomplish a lot, especially when you make sacrifices on your end. But to the percentage of the audience, who I assume to be some of the older folk who believe that through hard work alone you can pretty much accomplish anything, let me remind you that the world you grew up in is nearly completely irrecognizable from the current one we have now. Your distant reality wherein with an average wage you got to support an entire family with multiple children and vehicles is an experience that none of us will ever get to live en masse again. Simply because of how different the world is now. You dealt with problems that we didn't deal with, we're dealing with problems that you caused, and we're the ones picking apart the pieces and trying to make sure that we all don't turn into dust by we're 30, so why don't you help a fellow pal out, huh? By showering us with genuine wisdom like writing things like these, things that evoke feelings and emotions that a vast majority of us are screaming about internally but just can't get out because of what people expect of us. You know, genuine wisdom and guidance instead of the constant high-horsing that involves how lazy the newer generations must be. Though I do believe the narrative wherein every generation believes that they're the best one. There might even be a time where I believe that I'm better than some of the younger folk out there, and I hope that day doesn't come. But to put all the blame on the generation that came before you or succeeds you is nothing short of emotional lashing out that doesn't take into account the bigger picture that actual critical thinking would involve. It's more or less a societal thing, really, putting all the expectations on the younger guys. After all, they'll be around longer than us, they'll be around to replace us, and they'll be around to, hopefully, make the world better than what we went through. Just don't forget that each and every single one of them matter. They might just forget that themselves when they grow up along the way due to any mistreatment from permeating societal cancers. That's all sad stuff, really, and we have to talk about the sad stuff every now and then. Otherwise, we'll all be painting ourselves with paper smiles. So let's talk about the kind of grown-up that nobody likes, that everyone wants to make fun of and nobody wants to be around. Remember how I said we don't do degrading? I'll make an exception here, just for you, pal. Let's talk about narcissists! Coming towards the opposite end of the self-esteem spectrum is the conceited man, a rather dapper-looking fellow with a suit and hat, but that's sort of all there is to him. I'm not gonna do this guy the favor of carefully picking apart his character, as he's got about as much depth to him as a salt flat, and besides, his ridiculousness is actually pretty straightforward. The conceited man represents someone who is so enamored and obsessed with their own self-image and how other people perceive them, that all they hear is praise and admiration. Now, I understand that a vast majority of people love a good helping of praise and admiration, but when you make that all that matters to you, that can become a very dangerous way of thinking. Now, as a writer, aspiring author, and someone who enjoys delving into creative endeavors in general, you don't want to hear only praise about you. You want to listen to the people criticizing you. You want to listen to the people pointing out your weaknesses, as how else are you going to get other perspectives? No amount of self-awareness is going to lend you the ultimate power of letting you know at all times what's wrong with you. We're humans. We have blind spots. Because if you only ever choose to hear the good things people say about you, that could lead to stagnation. And with stagnation, you'll either end up doing the same things over and over again, depriving yourself of the opportunities to improve in other aspects, or you'll end up thinking that you're perfectly capable of doing everything, and that's a really bad way to go about life. But you know, there's also people who are living their life completely indifferent to what others think of them, which isn't the point either. It's a really tough balance to maintain, how other people perceive you versus how you think of yourself, but at the end of the day, they both matter. All perspectives matter. All perspectives are worth accounting for, as no one can ever really see the full picture of another person, much less themselves. Which brings us to another grown-up who thinks that the perspectives of others is all that matters, a grown-up that doesn't really experience the world for themselves. The geographer, a person who the Little Prince describes as someone with a real profession for once, and I'd have to agree since out of all the grown-ups in the story, he's one of the least absurd given the simple reasonings and justifications behind his work. Now, as a geographer, he of course has the responsibilities of recording and writing down the physical features of any lands that he hears about, whether this would involve counting the number of mountains, rivers, oceans, plains, essentially anything you would expect to see in a map. And as a matter of fact, he's rather diligent and committed to his work. I'd even go so far as to say that he rather enjoys doing it, evidenced by the number of books he has lying around containing his various writings and recordings of the different lands. And, you know, writing books ain't easy, so I have actual respect for him. So it wouldn't take much thinking to understand why the Little Prince decided to ask about the various physical features that the geographer's planet had. After all, out of all the planets he had come to visit, this was the biggest one prior to coming to Earth, and it was very beautiful. But unfortunately, this is a grown-up with grown-up perspectives, so this is where most of the good things that I have to say about the geographer end, as he could not name a single feature about his own planet. Now, this isn't a situation where the geographer is physically incapable of exploring his own planet due to any dangers or perils. No, as a matter of fact, he simply has never left his own spot where he writes all his books. He makes it abundantly clear to the Little Prince that it isn't in his responsibilities or interests to go traveling, frolicking, globetrotting, the whole shebang, as he's concerned with his matters of consequence, which is his studious academic writing, so he doesn't have the time to be bothered away from his desk work. But here I know you're asking, wait, this guy's a geographer. How's he supposed to write down and record the various features of different lands, let alone know about them, if he's never left his desk? Well, that's because the geographer doesn't make any observations at all. He relies on the accounts of other people, explorers, for all his information. All knowledge, all information that he writes down in his books are sourced exclusively from other people. He never experiences anything for himself. And you know, if you base your understanding about the world entirely on what other people say, only on what other people say, you could end up with a distorted and twisted perception. But to his credit, the geographer demands proofs and evidence of all these claims that his explorers report, much like any other rational person would. But that's not the point! Any of you who have played a game of telephone would understand that the more a piece of knowledge gets passed down, the more distorted and twisted it gets, as each generation has its own unique way of telling their stories, so much so that you stray very far from the original message, wherein you get things like the saying, blood is thicker than water, which most people interpret as familial connections are more substantial and important than the ones you make yourself. But that's not true! The whole saying is the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb, which says the exact opposite, wherein the relationships you form yourself are more important and substantial because you get to actually pick. Insane ranting aside, you can see how dangerous only relying on the knowledge of others for your perception of reality can get, as while receiving a potentially distorted version of the real world is one of the more, I suppose, benign disadvantages to this kind of reasoning. You could also get a version of reality specifically fabricated to benefit others or to cause harm. When you aren't critical of your surroundings, when you don't bring into question the norms and conventions we conform to and ask why we conform to them, when you blindly accept what other people dictate to be reality, you are setting yourself up to believe in something that just isn't true. There will always be people who will try to offer these gross simplifications of reality in order to make sense of the innately confusing and complicated nature of the world, but the thing is, these simplifications never offer the full picture. They never give the full value and meaning of something. They don't offer the full context. And oftentimes, these simplifications are built to bring either harm or benefit to a certain group of people, as if enough people believe in something completely delusional, it can become real. That's how powerful belief can get, with how entire societies and cultures are shaped by ideas that are potentially untrue, arbitrary, or straight up exist just to hurt people. I have a very good and very intelligent friend who tells me that people believe in what they understand, and while you can argue that even that phrase is a gross simplification of how human nature works, I have to agree with it with how much truth there really is to it. Citing Dostoevsky with her reasonings, a wall for them is something calming, morally decisive, and final, perhaps even something mystical. They are stupid, I won't deny that, but perhaps a normal person ought to be. How can you tell? Perhaps it is even a very fine thing to be. She tells me she is envious of dumb people, and I have to agree with that, but only sometimes. After all, when you're dumb, it's much easier to be happy. When you're dumb, you don't have to think about things too much. When you think you understand everything, when you don't have to doubt yourself about things, that brings peace to a lot of people. And while I advocate for everyone to believe in what brings them peace, I cannot accept when that peace is founded on things that aren't true and things that bring harm to other people. But even so, no matter how much understanding you have about a certain something, you as an individual will never realize or see the full picture. Humans tend to think two-dimensionally, even when there's always layers to something. Exactly why it's always important to think about the perspectives of other people, as other people could see things in a way that you never even think of. Exactly why it's important to not only make friends with people who are exactly like you. Admittedly, however, I suppose it is entirely possible to go about your entire life without considering more than a surface-level analysis of how things work, and maybe it's easier to find peace and happiness that way. But nothing actually fulfilling was ever easy in the first place, so I believe a reasonable person would go through their life trying to find their peace, not at the expense of greater truths. It's just that, reasonable people are hard to come by with how a lot of people, I believe, choose to be stupid, i.e., they actively choose to stop learning about the world in order to find their peace, but other people are made unreasonable by circumstances. People like the king. Now, don't take it lightly when I say that out of all the characters in The Little Prince, the king was the most difficult for me to pick apart, as I blame that entirely on the fact that his dialogue is either complete nonsense, or wrapped around in so much subtext, we could endlessly debate about what he means to represent for hours on end. But that's part of the beauty of literary analysis, especially when a story is up to multiple interpretations, as you get to figure out yourself how you relate to the characters inside of it, and how you relate to their perspective. And the king just so happens to be one of those characters who I believe can tend towards more than, heck, even two perspectives, depending on how you look at him. So for me, I think The King is a commentary on the perspectives of only the most grown-uppiest of grown-ups, that is, the elderly, and I boil that down to mainly three reasons. One being the fact that he's a king, two, the fact that he's actually old, as it is mentioned in the story, and three, the way I see his perspectives. To paint you a picture of why I had so much trouble with this guy, let me just describe the ridiculous interactions the king had with the little prince. So far, the little prince was busy zipping around from planet to planet in his journeys across the stars, so when he arrived to the king's planet, he was tired from his travels. But before the two even started talking to each other, the king saw the little prince approaching from a distance, and immediately announced to himself how pleased he was at finally seeing a subject approach him, which LP was justifiably confused at, as neither of the two had previously met each other. But it's not like leaders in real life personally know each and every single one of their subjects, so sure. So he steps foot on the king's planet, and because LP is a little tired from his journeys, he is a little drowsy. He lets out a yawn as he naturally would. But the king doesn't like that. He tells him it is contrary to etiquette to yawn in the presence of a king. Understandable. I mean, you probably wouldn't yawn if you met a leader of significance in real life, but come on man, it's a little kid. A sleepy little kid, in fact. Why are you bossing him around? So, in spite of his previous unapologetically savage behavior, the little prince does have some manners and promptly says sorry to the king for being so rude as to yawn in front of him, citing that he is quite tired from his journeys. And a rational person would expect a response from the king that is something along the lines of, "It's fine, don't worry about it, just don't do it again." Or the king might even demand some sort of punishment or compensation. After all, this is a caricature, and it wouldn't go against the narrative if the king was cartoonishly petty over something as simple as table manners. But, I'd like you to take those expectations out for a bit, alright? Ask him out to a nice steak dinner, go see your favorite movie together, and maybe even take them along a drive around the block in your fancy rental. I want you to look at those expectations intimately in the eyes, and just forget about them completely. Because Upon receiving an apology from the little prince for being so rude as to yawn, he then orders LP to yawn, the king, who says it upon himself that you shouldn't yawn in front of him, then retracts it completely and says, wait, no, you should yawn in front of me. Yawning is good. Do it, yawn. But LP isn't feeling it anymore, alright? Because I don't think most people do choose to yawn. So he doesn't have the feeling of yawning anymore, and he can't do it. And he's sorry that he can't do it. He shouldn't be sorry that he can't do it, but he says sorry anyway that he can't do it anymore. And then the king orders him to only sometimes yawn, and sometimes not yawn. Ain't that a kick in the head? He also claims to have power and rulership over all the stars and cosmos. Not ownership, like the businessman, mind you, not ownership. He claims to have control over the stars, authority over all the stars. You see why I don't like this guy so much? To solidify this claim, and because the little prince himself marvels at such a power he had never seen before, he asks a very simple favor of the king, a favor that would seem trivial if you really do have command over all the stars. He asks for a sunset, as there's nothing in the world that the little prince loves to see more than a sunset. And so you shall have it, the king proudly announces. After all, he claims to be the ruler of everything. But he shall have his sunset only when conditions are favorable. When are conditions favorable, you ask? In a few minutes from now. Oh, what would happen in a few minutes from now? The sunset. On its own, by its own accord, by its own volition, without any input from the king. But the little prince doesn't have time to wait around for when conditions are favorable, as he expected to receive his sunset now, as he expected that the king really did have authority over everything, as if you have authority over everything, you could have a sunset anytime you so wished. The king doesn't even have authority over the little prince, much less the stars, as LP ditches him later on for being full of himself, despite the king repeatedly ordering him to stay. He also goes on an insane tirade about how his orders are reasonable, with such analogies as if he ordered one of his generals to turn into a seabird, the king would be at fault if the general could not fulfill such a request, along with if he ordered his people to throw themselves into the sea, they would of course rise up in revolution, as those are not reasonable orders. The king only gives out reasonable orders. But it's with this part where my entire analysis on him pretty much hinges on, as while there very well could be more nonsense with him than actual patterns, it's with a phrase he says that tells me enough. It doesn't tell me everything, it just tells me enough. The king, in justifying why his orders are reasonable, says, one must require from each one the duty which each one can perform. That tells me enough. Recalling to what I mentioned earlier, where there are grown-ups who go about life where they are so focused on fulfilling the expectations of others that they forget about themselves, the king occupies a similar school of reasoning but with a more societal scale, wherein he clings on to expectations so much that he forgets about what other people are capable of. The line, one must require from each one the duty which each one can perform, translates to me as the king saying, I expect this certain group of people to be able to do this certain thing. And that way of thinking is fine with things like professions, as you obviously wouldn't go to a carpenter if you're looking for a heart transplant, but expectations are, again, simplifications of very complicated things. And when you make them your entire personality, your entire way of thinking, you forget about what other people are able to do. You forget about individuals. You expect a certain group to be able to do a certain thing because they're a part of that group. When you rely on these oversimplifications of how people should behave, you are setting yourself up to be prejudiced and bigoted, as when you let all the expectations do the thinking for you, you forget that individuals are capable of so much more than what society arbitrarily labels onto them. And I believe it's the elderly who are most susceptible to clinging on to these kinds of expectations, as number one, they've been around long enough that they believe that they know all there is to the world, when in reality the world is a constantly changing place. And number two, we literally impose the same kind of expectations onto them. We place the elderly on a pedestal in society wherein we rely on them the most for their guidance, their wisdom, their authority, as they've literally been here longer than us, so they must know more, and it's only natural that you place authority on the more knowledgeable of us. But like I said, the world is a constantly changing place wherein certain norms and conventions go outdated, or we eventually realize that they're outright harmful to us, or, the human life is way too short for you to have substantial experience in absolutely everything, so you shouldn't have authority over everything either. Experience and seniority, I believe, may overlap, but one can exist without the other. Seniority, you don't have to work towards it. Experience, you have to work plenty towards it. I've seen my fair share of miserable old fossils who demand your utmost respect and authority over everything, not because they're actually knowledgeable in certain aspects about life, but simply because they're old. Because at the end of the day, your position of authority relies on others' belief in your position of authority, and when enough people stop believing, you have nothing. Try as you might to justify that your orders are reasonable based on some fancy title or other predetermined role, there will always be people who will end up not believing in you when they believe that there are others more capable than you. And human capability should never hinge on predetermined prejudice, preconceived bigotry, as those four rely on expectations that could be simplifications that never get the full picture of an individual. And again, it's not entirely on the elderly's fault for often thinking like this. After all, we impose similar expectations unto them, and so they tend to believe in those predetermined roles. An argument which I complement with the fact that he's a king. Kings and the monarchy in general, no one picks them to be our leaders. They're destined to be in a position of leadership from birth because of their family name, their status, their title, and so they believe in that status wholeheartedly. They believe that just because of a predetermined role, that's all you're capable of, that's all you should do. But in truth, all humans are capable of doing anything they choose to do so, that they choose to be. To summarize, The Little Prince visits a total of 6 planets with their each respective grown-up, and with every visit, he comes to learn about the different perspectives when it comes to what grown-ups think really matter in life. With each interaction, however, he grows more confused than the last, as he really struggles in understanding the absurd things that most grown-ups would call normal. He set out on this journey in search of friendship, but he never found it with any of the 6 grown-ups, as he found their reasonings much too confusing for his liking. And that may very well have been the case up until the end of the story if it wasn't for his arrival on Earth, wherein he meets some of the most significant characters of the story. When the Little Prince arrived on Earth, he spent an entire year in our humble home, and during that time he met with a great deal of perspectives. Grown-ups, animals, flowers, the narrator, he talked to everyone really, and with each interaction, he learned more and more about the world while simultaneously remaining as confused as ever. But of all his interactions, even his friendship with the narrator, I believe that none of them remained as significant and impactful to him as his time with the fox. The fox is an elusive character. Up until its meeting with the Little Prince, it lived a fairly monotonous life, running around hunting chickens, going into burrows, and evading capture from the humans out to get it, much like how 1,000 other foxes would spend their days. And when the Little Prince met the fox, he was just like 1,000 other little boys to it. They had no need of each other, as there were innumerable quantities of boys and foxes before that had no prior need of each other. So how come they would come to matter to one another? Well, as luck would have it, the fox knew a great deal when it came to matters of consequence, as it carried with it an understanding that I don't think even the narrator could have provided the Little Prince, as when the two inevitably had to depart, the fox left with the Little Prince a gift that LP would carry for the rest of his days. But first, I'd like to mention how much I appreciate that Mr. Exupéry made the most important characters of the story, the ones that pass down the best wisdoms, all non-human. It frees the mind of the reader from making any assumptions or expectations about how certain things can only come from certain people. And although we love to project our human emotions and characteristics onto inanimate objects and animals, the fact that it is a fox allows it to occupy the perspective of pretty much anyone in the world. The fox can be anyone in the world, but because they are elusive, they are very, very, very hard to find. It lets you remember that of all the thousands and thousands of people in the world, you will never appreciate the full value of anyone just by taking a look at them. We love to say that every human is special and unique in the world, and while that's partly because every human really is that different from each other and having an exact copy of another person is completely impossible, it's also because that each person matters to another person in a different way. It's the how and why something, or more importantly someone, matters to you that lets you really dig deep about understanding the true meaning and value about something, as the more you think about something, the more open you become to different perspectives. For the Little Prince and the Fox, they didn't need to do much thinking about how they mattered to each other at the start of their relationship, as they were nothing more than what they saw, a fox and a little boy. But through time, lots and lots of time, the Little Prince and the Fox grew to know about each other more than what they saw. They learned about each other's perspectives, how they saw the world, and generally how they liked to live their life. But this relationship had to end eventually, as the Little Prince still had many places to go at this point in the story, which made the both of them really sad. But it is with this departure wherein the Little Prince found comfort in receiving the best piece of wisdom that he had ever come to learn, a simple phrase uttered by the fox that held all its weight more than 80 years ago now and still holds all its value today.
What is essential is invisible to the eye.
Much like thousands of other proverbs and sayings like that, it can have myriads of interpretations, but that's a good thing, as that's what makes it truly unique from all the other phrases, is how it matters to different people, how different people relate to it, as it's bound to have different nuances when it comes to different perspectives. For me, it means that there are three things in life that you should value the most. That is, relationships, i.e. the power of friendship, memories, and time. Now, with that first one, I know how much of a cliche it is to have the grand message of a story be the power of friendship and how important relationships are in life, but some messages really are just that simple. It's just that messages like that get told in increasingly complicated ways in stories so that people would continuously think about them. As if I blatantly told you at the start of the video how much relationships matter in life, you would probably agree, but you would probably also wouldn't think about it too much. People don't like being lectured like that, especially when it comes to things that are seemingly obvious like that, as wisdom is supposed to help you think about things really carefully, and that can't happen if I just told you bluntly. So the beauty in wrapping a cliche message like that in a neat little fairy tale like this is that it gets you thinking, as never once in The Little Prince is it blatantly said that relationships matter the most in the world. It just says what is essential is invisible to the eye, so you are free to think about it. You're free to find the meaning yourself, and whether or not you agree with that or apply it to your life is up to you to decide. One of the other things that matter the most is memories, and that's mainly because no other human could possibly have the same exact memories as you. Sure, you can have the same memories with someone from time to time with your experiences together, but those memories will always matter differently to you because you have different perspectives and you will feel differently about those memories compared to other people. And that's also because how memories are hardly replicable, which is exactly why nostalgia can be so powerful to some people, because it evokes those sentiments, those emotions that can never be captured again, because it's from a time that they didn't have to worry about things too much. And with that final one, time, I think that's the one that mattered the most ever in all of human history, as everything else discussed hinges on time being spent. You can't form a relationship with someone if you don't have meaningful time together. You can't have worthwhile memories if you didn't spend your time carefully. In a world where almost everything has become instantaneous for the sake of our convenience, many people start failing to see the value in something because they didn't spend much time to think about it. They didn't spend much time to achieve it. They didn't spend much time working towards it. That's time for you. You never really see it, but it always seems to be everywhere. So spend yours well and spend it wisely. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Hey, thanks for sticking around. You must really love watching a youngster ramble on and on about books then, don't ya? A person with that kind of patience in the 21st century? What an exception! But you're in luck, as I don't just like talking about books alone, so if you're looking to see something else in the future, something that probably wouldn't put you to sleep, consider sticking around for a little while longer. It'll mean a lot. Now, some comments on why I love The Little Prince so much is that I first came to read it around elementary because we had to do a book report on it, and during that time I always thought that it was just about the comparison of the adult world and the child world, and basically I thought the ultimate message was you should never forget your inner child. And that, while that's still a valid interpretation of the story, cut young me some slack, alright? He couldn't have possibly picked on the philosophical commentary on this thing when his brain was filled to the brim with FNAF series back then, alright? It was a different time. Come on, cut me some slack, please. So imagine my surprise rereading this thing all these years later and seeing just how much it's able to talk about meaningful stuff in such a short length. It's a novella after all, so it's obviously not that long, but reading this thing will let you come to terms with how little numbers actually do in providing the value in something. It's a charming little read, enough to fill a quiet afternoon's worth of time, so if you're looking to get into literature but don't know where to start or don't have a lot of time, well, this is a good place to try out. Read the book for yourself and really take the time to come to terms with how it matters to you, as it's bound to matter differently to different people. As I've said before, other people have different ways to relate to it, as we all have different lives to experience. But no matter how you interpret The Little Prince, its messages, at the end of the day, those are ideals. And the thing about ideals is that they're notoriously difficult to uphold in real life. Along with the fact that all the perspectives presented in the book, they all matter. Alright, I'm not saying that what the 6 grown-ups are talking about don't matter at all. It's just saying that there's always layers to something. And when you make your life all about only one thing, where you make this thing matter the most out of everything because of arbitrary reasons, you lock yourself out of perspectives, you lock yourselves out of different ways of thinking, and it's a tragedy, really. But what's a young, spry fella like me really got to say about the world, eh? Look at this face. The light is still in his eyes, and his hopes and dreams have hardly been whittled down yet. What's he got to know about the real world? Hey, I may not have seen much of the real world yet, but I've already heard of how scary it could be. I mean, you have to stand in lines, fill out forms, and do small talk. Ugh. Regardless, thanks a lot for sticking around. You must seem like a really smart fella if you're able to reach all the way to the end of this video, but to be fair, I never meant for it to get this long. I'm looking at the raw footage now, and yeah, it's not looking good. But, you know, it's just that there was always something to talk about, and boy do I love talking, if that wasn't plainly obvious already. And because I believe you're such a smart fella, I also believe you can pick apart The Little Prince in your own neat little way, a perspective or interpretation you could really relate to. And maybe we could talk about that together sometime. But for now, goodbye, and from now on, ad astra per aspera.